Jussi Parikka to have a talk to us. Jussi is a very familiar guy for the Turku group from the Department of Cultural History, but he has been working now in many places around Europe, and now he is at the University of Aarhus in Denmark and works as a professor of digital aesthetics and culture. And he also leads the digital aesthetics research center in Aarhus. And you are also in Prague, I guess, a visiting professor in FAMU. Jussi has actually been very productive during the last decades. We just heard that actually Jussi's first book, Koneoppi, I don't know how that translates into English, but it's in German, it's very easy, it's Maschinenlehre.
Yeah.
so it will be translated into Estonian, and it will be nice to hear how the response will be.
Yeah.
But after that, Jussi has published actually Digital Contagions, a media archaeology of computer viruses, that was 2007, and Insect Media, 2010, what is media archaeology, 2012, and a geology of media, 2015, and operational images, 2023, and several other books. And I guess Jussi has a profile of a media archaeologist in many ways and on many levels, but also as a scholar of digital cultures in broad terms. So very warmly welcome. And Jussi's talk today is Ecology in Digital Culture, or what the planetary scale crisis means for our methods. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just put on the slides. Wait a minute, here we go. Let's put these on and then I'll start talking. It's clearly I can't do two things at the same time. I can actually, but it's, yeah, that's really super kind, Hannu. Moi kaikille tutuille ja hello to everyone I haven't met yet. It would be much nicer to be there, and let me just sort of give a brief prelude of what's going to follow in terms of the talk. You heard the title already, and I'll sort of talk through certain things. I've got notes as well, and I've got several slides with text, so it will be a slightly old school, but I think that I might just also at some points, not perhaps improvise, but not follow only the script. Let me see where I have things. This is not, somehow this is not, oh yeah, here we go. Oh yeah, true. So basically, this is what we're going to end up with. This is the last slide, more or less. So I'm going to show it first, obviously, because logic is not my forte, but it makes sense to sort of give you a preemptive note on what's going to follow. It really relates to questions of what are computational practices, including methods, from the point of view of ecology and environmental thinking, but not just thinking, but also practice, and the ways in which two separate things, or at least they feel separate, about humanities methods in the large sense, including digital and computational methods, relate or should relate or must relate to questions of ecological footprint and so forth. Might be an obvious topic, but of course, as we know, it has lots of repercussions across the board. But before that, I'll try to speak for about half an hour or so, roughly speaking, and then we'll definitely have time for questions. So really a big thank you, Marek, Hannu, everybody there. It's really would be so nice to be there. Hannu asked me to talk about some recent themes in digital culture research, and I know that our Turku trio will, after me, talk about this in a more systematic manner. Mine is not systematic in that sense. I'm going to just dip into a particular theme of ecology and environmental media or environmental questions of digital culture, which is a topic close to my heart for various reasons and in various kind of academic things as well. And I want you to think about there's sort of session that comes later in a way as the complementary part. So the things that I might not discuss might come up in the later sessions by Turku colleagues. And of course, I really wish that I could be there. I'm actually just on the other side of the Gulf at the moment due to family duties, nice family duties in southeast Finland, in Kotka. So, so hello from the north side across the little Gulf. It's not, I was thinking, is this, there's a beautiful word in Finnish, aasinsilta, sort of like just kind of a jumping into a topic with really, little logical connection. Not sure if this is aasinsilta, but I just wanted to mention, as already mentioned, that sort of a small Finnish book that came out 20 years ago is exactly coming out. This machine and you already sort of pronounced the German version, but it's Masinaopetus in Estonian. I'm super happy about that. And I'm going to use it as a sort of a bridge, aasinsilta, into topic of today as well. I'm really grateful for the translation project, and hopefully this will also launch some dialogues across across the Gulf, but also across 20 years of humanities research into technology, basically. In Finnish, it was called koneoppi. Doesn't really translate in English so nicely. Nowadays it does, because we talk about machine learning, but it was way before the AI trend of machine learning came about, and it mostly referred to really old-fashioned engineering, sort of pedagogics or techniques of understanding of how machine work in a very nitty-gritty fashion as well, nuts and bolts, literally. This is a mock cover, by the way. This will not be the final cover. It was a book that dealt with a particular entry of critical post-humanities in humanities research, with an attempt to connect digital culture research with theoretical humanities, and the sort of agendas that were emerging around late 1990s, or perhaps historians as we are, gradually from 1980s onwards, but 1990s and early 2000s, around so-called new cultural studies new cultural studies in general, but also new cultural studies of technology. The multitude of fields that dealt with science and technology, including, of course, STS, science and technology studies, but also other forms of media theory, from Bruno Latour to Friedrich Kittler, as well as feminist STS research, as well as feminist philosophy, such as Rosi Braidotti's, Donna Haraway, and so forth, really was a fundamental prelude to much of the stuff that happens across humanities over the past 20 years as well. I was lucky to dip into a bit of that already then, but of course after that, much of this has, one could say, escalated from particular way in which we theorize agency of technology, or the centrality of technology as knowledge formations, as in my topic today as well, to the sort of a massive scale planetary crisis that we often call the Anthropocene, which is a good term whether one accepts it or not, because it doesn't refer only to climate change, but to the variety of multitude of polycrises, from biodiversity, food, water, to, of course, the changing chemical balance of atmospheres, and the ways in which that implies a changing task for the humanities as well. Among many good writers and theorists in our fields, of course, Dipesh Chakrabarty's work on rethinking historiographic ways of understanding temporality and history in the age of Anthropocene is influential. Dipesh Chakrabarty will feature a bit later today as well in my talk. And still the main sort of a gist of the talk will be really about the ways in which the planetary scale of crisis of the Anthropocene runs parallel to the technological infrastructures that have come to play a role in inducing the so-called harm. I mean, not so-called harm, but the harm. And it's also the baseline of how we know about the crisis. In other words, we wouldn't know about the scale of the crisis without computational methods that have gradually emerged, especially in this context of climate models at the back of Cold War. So we could talk of the pharmacon of technology in this sense as well, that is the cause. I mean, it's the poison and it's the cure in certain ways. Not sure about the cure, but we'll see. Many of these theories are, of course, strange bedfellows. You wouldn't usually want to talk about feminist theories like Rosie Braidotti and Haraway in the same sentence with Friedrich Kittler, but we'll leave that aside. The main thing is to really think through of what have these approaches to material, human and more than human approaches, and how they have moved from the margins of humanities inquiry into the central beef itself. This concerns much more than a history of particular theory, but it actually, and going closer to our topic today as well, of trying to understand of what were the ways in which this helped us to think about humanities formations, such as archives, meaning and such, from the point of view of technology, like Wolfgang Ernst's work. But my interest has also been of what would be not just the conditions of humanities knowledge in technology and media, but what are the environmental conditions of those media and technologies. You can see it as a recursive chain of conditions. And of course, that's pretty much how it goes and how I understand mediation as well. Now, this has been really my point of really trying to understand of what would be the ways in which our theoretical ways of understanding humanities, but also like today, our methods can speak to this situation and not just address it as a topic, but integrate it into the very core of what we do as well. To try to understand what are the environmental and energetic costs of doing humanities, doing academic work. Humanities usually is the pretty low tech and pretty low carbon footprint when one considers the massive scales of some certain other academic and scientific research institutes, whether you think of the widening of the question of the laboratory from individual labs to those massive scale infrastructures like CERN. We are pretty sort of marginal in this case, but I want to claim that it still is crucial for us to think about, especially with our interest in computational methods and the ways in which a lot of the work of, let's say, technologically oriented humanities is piggybacking, is conditioned by access to large-scale computational resources. And that will be, again, the key point of my talk as such. Might not be anything new, but it's probably a good theme to raise also when we are considering the start of the project and thinking about digitization, thinking about, again, methods as such. So what will follow are brief points about environmental materiality and how environmental humanities is infused with this media studies or digital culture studies agenda, and what this means from the perspective of the already long established baseline of research in data studies. In other words, that there are large-scale energy costs of datafication, and it also relates to all kinds of things that I won't be the specialist to solve, but I'm going to put it out there as well in terms of people interested in semiotics, is exactly the question of what are the material and even energetic underpinnings of science systems, especially when science systems become large-scale planetary infrastructures, not just human in those terms as well. So just a bit of context as first. Like Hannu mentioned, I'm lucky to be one of the graduates from Turku and cultural history, and I proudly carry the sort of term of being somewhat trained as a cultural historian, even if my work has been mostly identified as media theory. But nowadays I work in a so-called humanities IT department in Aarhus of digital design and information studies, where we don't really do digital humanities as such, but look at design and visual and software studies. Many of those fields that more or less parallel but even preceded digital humanities, but we are as interested in the question of cultural computing and cultural design. Since 22, when I started in Aarhus, I'm still affiliated with, I've got this temporary affiliation with Prague for various project reasons. I'm leading this project that started in 22 that continues for a couple of months more, probably gradually ends in 25. design and aesthetics for environmental data. And it's a good starting point for some of the discussions, even if it's not exactly a response to what I'm talking about today. The project has been premised on the focus on materiality of environmental data, as it is linked to questions of environmental change. At the back of our team's idea with Mei Wong and Paolo Patelli, that back soon again, is to look at histories of, or basic historicize of what environmental data is, not merely as the usual form of environmental data or the data science of environment, which is an interesting topic as such. In other words, not just the numbering or counting or quantification of environmental change, but how it relates to multiple scales of material infrastructures of datafication. In other words, with two people, Mei and Paolo. Mei is already now actually finished her project period and now is assistant professor in Utrecht Media Studies, focused on questions of eco-media by way of looking at concrete landscape design plans, especially in Denmark, the so-called energy islands, which have remained more or less an imaginary of energy for Europe and European energy security. From the point of view of wind. And Paolo, who trained as an architect, has looked at various kinds of ecological models in experimental design and art practices, alongside my own work that has theorized but also mapped some of these related issues in a historical context as well. Now, I'm not going to talk about this project. There's also a link to anyone who wants later on to listen to what we did for Helsinki Biennial 23 in a slightly different key than academic. I'm not going to talk about this particular project so much, but it's a good sort of a segue to thinking about the ways in which critical data studies and broadly digital culture studies has shifted from data as merely about a particular computational numbering to the material infrastructures that underpin the conditions of datafication. Now, most of the times when I talk about the project and I mention that it's about environmental data and architectures of environmental data, the usual response, and it's not a bad response, is to think that it relates to data centers. And true, that has already grown into a whole subfield in media or digital studies as such, and that's interesting as such. Critical data center studies field as well, that looks at the particular ways in which geographies of data are related to the axis of energy, sustainability governance, as well as geopolitics of security. I mean, as we know, over the past couple of years intensively, and of course for a long time as well. We don't need to rehearse that line of argument being in Estonia and Finland as such. But Finland would be a great case study as such. Where I'm now as well, at least a region, roughly speaking, where I'm now is an interesting hotspot for reasons of thinking about architectures and landscapes and geographies of data due to the Google servers in Hamina, but also emergence of new large-scale data hosting facilities near the river Kymijoki, at the back of the historical transition from paper mill industries to data industries over the past years. There's one or two very large ones emerging in the region now as well, which of course is interesting from the point of view of cultural history, I mean cultural heritage of landscapes as well, and the transitioning points at which particular identification becomes the way in which that landscape becomes electrified in new kinds of ways as the sort of a business discourse goes, but also that it sort of relates to the material underpinning of where data comes from in relation to energy, in relation to sustainability. This is, of course, at the back of a discourse we probably all know well. The centrality of energy electricity demands by large-scale computational resources from Ireland to many other small, quote-unquote, small countries, and with especially the sort of a like size of a country in relation to electricity needs, in relation to the provision for not just the country, but in case of Ireland, but also Finland, in case of all of this, it is really a weird sort of a like a discourse about a particular nation state having to bear the brunt of the electricity demands at the same time when the provision of the sort of a on-demand service of data, whether it's your Netflix or Google's or whatever, is catering to beyond the nation state. So you can see the kind of interesting dilemmas there, especially because it is not only anymore solvable by way of the usual sustainability discourse, a bit more on that in a second, just because of the sheer size of the electricity needs. In other words, the short version of this is that that even with the kind of a relatively effective, if we would assume a relatively effective transition to so-called renewable energies, the actual energy demands are just becoming humongously big at the moment because of data. And this is the kind of a key point, and I keep on coming back to the term externalities, right? In the classical sort of accounting sense of externalities that has been picked up in all kinds of much beyond, critical economics, that externalities have been the way in which current business models, until now at least, have been able to calculate profit because of being able to externalize environmental damage of the corporate actions. And in a similar way, we can talk of externalities in the expanded sense of not just corporate business sectors, but the ways in which other sectors also externalize particular things that perhaps shouldn't be externalized from their quote unquote accounting procedures. Humanities is not really about accounting, but the ways in which we account for, as we count, sorry for the word pun, we account for as we count, as in computational methods, whether we account for the externalities of ecological costs of our counting, as in computational methods, is where this becomes a really interesting twist and turn in terms of what this sort of a big picture is about. Right. Now, we're not in Ireland, but this concerns, of course, us. It's just one key European example. So if you want a headline, it's a very simple one, of course, as well. It really is about digital cultures, material media, as digital and data culture as energetic and material sort of a mode of activity. And this topic has, of course, consolidated over the past 10, 15 years from individual research on, for instance, supply chain of materials, but also energy, the ways in which screen technologies are central sites, quote unquote, central sites of electronic waste, from all kinds of individual impactful case studies to a bigger, broader field of inquiry that relates to the production of digital technologies and their use as contributions to increasing energy needs of data and digital businesses, and how much of this relates to, again, large-scale extractivist industries as such. On the one hand, this would become statistically much more prevalent or evident when looking at sort of so-called cultural computing or cultural uses of large-scale computational resources. Think of Netflix, for instance. But also, interestingly, the whole transition, the so-called green transition as such as well, and the ways in which even our transition away from petrofossil fuel industries is premised on what will be de facto an increased, at least temporary increased energy needs and probably permanently increased energy needs, but also the increased, massively so increased need for other resources, not least rare earth minerals, a topic that was close to my heart in some of my work that I'll mention soon. So you can see the sort of the evident point of where we are at with this whole sort of excuse my French, shit show of transition and reliance on petrofossil fuel industry. And we'll get to academia very soon as well. Not that I'm sort of actually ending up saying that we're super bad, but still it's good to think about it. There's three aspects. I did this sort of at the back of my head, just doodling a bit in terms of how to structure the existing research and approaches, not just research, but also policy around questions of media materiality and waste, as well as energy. On the one hand, while we are increasingly aware, and one of the reasons why this has been discussed over the past year is because of also computer science awareness of the massive scale energy costs of large language models, AI, as part of the whole, what I'm sort of paraphrasing others, unsustainability of AI as it concerns these infrastructural underpinnings of this kind of a computational resources. There would be, of course, the whole longer story, as we as historians know. It's not that the previous technical media was in any way green either. The ways in which we can narrate all kinds of earlier screen technologies like CRTs, cathode ray tubes, and others as such as chemical toxic dump sites, and the ways in which this situation has evolved gradually over the past at least 100 years, from film and the different plastic media of other kinds to the sort of energetic questions that we are now facing. Then there sort of like social, sociological policy aspects that I hinted as well. Would regulation of AI have to be more about instead of the rather silly talk about AI taking over humankind, to be actually about the ways in which energy costs are being regulated, and the ways in which this relates to all kinds of questions of not just regulation of e-waste, electronic waste, but also in terms of looking at data centers and the infrastructures of not just entertainment, but knowledge production. Again, we're very marginal in this sort of a scene, but still it's good to mention it. And increasingly, this has been adopted as part of also European agenda as well. I was speaking with some Finnish and Nordic data center sustainability experts, and they actually see this as a big milestone that finally data center businesses have been put in the very central seat in the EU sustainability agenda and policy, including coming up with standards of what is an actually sustainable data center instead of the usual rhetoric. Now, my field usually is to theorize. I'm not going to do much of that now, but still, I think that it's a third way in which we can build interesting aspects to questions of design as well. The ways in which we theorize computing in relation to material underpinnings and ecological costs is, to me, the central part of how theory also can contribute to the broader ecological agenda as well. Some of this, I want to think, echoes what Dipesh Chakrabarty has been doing in a very sort of a different field, and yet not so different field as such. It echoes what Chakrabarty makes, the arguments that he makes in terms of historiographic modes of thinking. In short version, that the ways in which we have trained to understand history as a particular mode of inscription of time, meaning humans, non-humans, and such, is not the same kind of a beast anymore, or shouldn't be, that it used to be. And that thinking of history in relation to the massive scale environmental change and its various links to environmental injustices across global north and global south is also forcing us to rethink temporality and the ways in which this relates to the multiple histories of nature and non-humans. In other words, that the natural history is not separate from social history, and the other is not external for the other as well. So I'm using this as a way of thinking through the couple of things that I really want to put forward as well today. So again, the idea that a lot of those things that I was interested in Koneoppi as well, not saying that it's, in Koneoppi as well, were part of that sort of a larger discussion that emerged over the past 30, 40 years in relation in philosophy and in humanities fields from different directions. You can think of Bernard Stiegler's work, but you can think of indeed the feminist science and technology studies like Donna Haraway's and many others as well, of trying to kind of push forward the point with different methods in different cases that technology itself is not external to humanities or meaning making, but it should be at the very core of it. This was also the thing that I was a lot interested in. But what would be then indeed the environmental in this mix as well? That technology itself is of the world, of particular kinds of infrastructures, and it sort of involves questions of the material grain. In other words, the sort of a pushback that materials do to us as well. Of course, we've sort of already moved in multiple fields again, including semiotics, and this is again not my field, so you know much better as well. But I find it interesting that the ways in which much of the work in philosophy of technology was paralleled in some work that basically pushed also semiotics to think of its relation to technical media, but also to mathematics, like Brian Rodman does really beautifully in 1980s and 1990s, as well as the world, the work in biosemiotics over decades, of course, as well. But to look at also that what would be the sort of the environmental climate change version of all of this, not necessarily biosemiotics, but still in that sort of a ballpark of thinking through of what is the material in question. I'm aware of the time as well, so I'm going to speed up and do a couple of things really briefly, headlines. Okay, so of course, there's a field, there's always a field, but there's a field in which a lot of this is being discussed. We're not in media studies sort of a situation now, but some of this relates really beautifully to our points as well. The recent reader on eco-media studies nails the situation quite well. If I'm not mistaken, this is the very first sentence of the whole book. And I think that that's exactly the sort of a question we're still grappling with, even if I want to claim that pretty much every one of us in the room and not in the room on Zoom is very aware of that, aware of that, and we already are responding in different ways. But I'm thinking about the institutional sort of a levels of global climate emergency as a challenge to academic programs as such. Besides their words, the editor's words, there are multiple ways in which this has been already, quote unquote, escalated, so to speak, including by some others quoted in that book as well, who not merely kind of point that, okay, ecology, we're really in trouble, and that has to do with academia as well, but that it obviously is related to questions of where and whom. In other words, the ways in which particular communities are much more vulnerable in relation to this question as such, global south in those terms, linking it to questions of decolonial agenda. I'll skip this geology of media bit, but it's mostly just to flag that this somewhat relates to what I was hoping to do in that earlier book of geology of media. Instead, I'll just mention a couple of works through Laura Marks. In Ecomedia, Laura Marks, I'll probably use about, I'll try to wrap up in about 6 minutes or so. So that's about 35 minutes then. So Laura Marks is a film and media studies scholar, but again, this relates to me nicely to the broader field of informatics, information studies, digital culture studies as well, of unfolding a picture through the notion of collapse informatics, which is not her invention. It's a term used by computer science scholars as well, critical computer science scholars as well, of thinking through what ICT means, not from the idea of abundance of materials, but from the way in which we think of computational resources as part of the regime of scarcity, and especially radical scarcity that might or might not come about by way of quote unquote collapse that might be ensuing in the horizon, whether it's a collapse of energy production or collapse of some other kind of environmentally sort of a conditioned event as such. And it's a good sort of thinking experiment, Gedanken experiment, but also not just a experiment, because it is really the situation we're in. And it really relates to questions, and I'm sort of thinking with Mark's here as well, and putting a couple of things forward, of rethinking of what, in her words, is mostly about ICT, information technology design, from the point of view of these if questions. If this service was used by all world's population, what would be the overall environmental impact of the infrastructure? This is, of course, echoes the usual discourse of sort of planetary resources. If the global south would start consuming as much as we do, what would happen? But it also is very aware of this, that it doesn't come out as the sort of a more problematic version, that we shouldn't allow global south to be using this, but is very much aware that this is something that needs to be discussed in relation to planetary scale environmental justice of various emerging economies and their energy uses, from Bangladesh to Turkey to South Korea and Vietnam and so forth as well. Marx really parks it at the point of the pandemic of past years, which in her words cemented a lot of unsustainable media practices of streaming videos, being on Zoom like I am, using high resolution, constantly on culture, a topic that again has been gradually discussed as well, the constant onness of digital culture and the kind of a constant ready for service culture as well. And trying to kind of think through of what that means for her field of media studies, especially one that is involved very much in streaming culture, where the streaming culture is a topic of film and media cultures and video cultures, and with implications to other fields as well. You can probably see where I'm going with this already. They've done also really interesting work where it comes out as recommendations. Both in terms of the multiple ways in which we should tackle carbon footprint, and none of this is probably surprising, and that's I'm still kind of voice it out there as well, from the sort of individual levels to what I find most interesting among perhaps the bigger levels as well, organizational, institutional levels of what would be the sort of practices that are energy efficient, that use particular kinds of protocols for practice, of academic practice as well, if we already going into the idea of what does this mean to academia, of thinking through low-risk cultures, thinking through our online cultures and various other forms of using of digital computational resources. She also, and their team, that she leads in the project that probably has finished by now, piggyback on earlier researchers in sustainable design, asking questions about design. Does design encourage infrastructural expansion? Does it encourage increased use, mitigate or reduce infrastructure use in some way? Does it encourage digital waste? Does the design promote the sharing of infrastructure? So a lot of this is indeed written from the point of view of general use of media-rich content. Again, streaming content, other forms of storage and computational resources. But I want to use this as a way of tweaking the questions as well. What if we can ask exactly this question where we replace the word design with methods? And now we're going into computational methods finally. Replace the word design here with method. Does the method encourage infrastructural expansion or obsolescence? Does the method encourage increased infrastructural use and so forth? And that's really the last section that I will skim through briefly as well, so that we get to questions. A couple of key points. So this would be about methods, and I've been, weirdly enough, not many humanities people often are interested in methods, but I've been, again, going back to it, especially because of work such as Celia Luris on interdisciplinary research methods, which really relates to questions of methods, not just as off-the-shelf ways of doing things, but really focusing on the activities, the gerund form of it as well. But which really relates us to the ways in which we practice particular academic activities as well. Much of the sort of a sector-wide discourse has been about de-investment. Is that the word? Uninvestment, de-investment? De-investment of large universities from fossil fuel industries, which is excellent. as well as the sort of questions that we probably come across about no-flying campaigns and such, and the idea that we're part of the carbon combustion complex as such. But I want to also raise the question of what is it then in relation to computational methods and infrastructures, and the ways in which we're increasingly kind of thinking through methods that are piggybacking on existence of quote unquote hope, or at least sorry.
No, it's okay.
All right. So from the point of view of sort of methods that are assume the existence of abundance of energy, abundance of large-scale, media-rich, energy-intensive sectors of culture, or even in some cases reproducing the patterns of use of the commercial sectors in the ways in which they're being designed or how they operate. Now, this would again be the question. Would this or that methodology be sustainable if employed at planetary scale? How can it relate, or might it relate on sustainability activity actually damaging digital, other practices that are digital that are damaging? And the ways in which we think beyond the usual scenarios of abundance of methods as without energy costs. Now, what would be, again, my sort of a tweak of what Laura Marks and others put out as well? She puts it like this, but I replaced the word service again here. Design question for collapse informatics scenario of restricted version of the method to be imagined. What would its value and structural burden be? In other words, we start thinking about not just externalities, but internalize that into the way in which we work. Now, obviously, this is not, and this is the more or less last slides, this is not actually me advocating that we should go away from large-scale computational methods and such. I'm not promoting a particularly necessarily always low-tech or slow computing approach. Some others do, like Laura Marks. I'm more interested in finding the right ways of how do we sustainably, in sustainable ways, bring questions of energy into questions of digital cultural heritage, digital methods and such. Otherwise, we would easily lead into sort of a Monty Python-esque situation in terms of these restrictions as well. You could come up with really great examples of how badly the idea of restricting academic resources could go. Probably it could mean something as absurd as forcing people to look only at sustainable things of digital culture, only at GIFs and text-based culture, and a ban on researching anything that relates to media-rich content, let alone streaming cultures. Perhaps it would be as Monty Python-esque to think about computational methods to be allowed only at the times of energy excess of the grid. In other words, for instance, when it's windy, that's when you can use computational methods only, or some other contingent random condition. We could come up with a list of random absurd things, and this pretty much proves my point that it's not really about being anti large-scale computing, but trying to think through what would be the sufficiently complex, relevant models that we can employ. The final thing, that this is exactly the point that we sort of start to need finding sort of answers to as well. A lot of popular discourse has gone the route of anti-computing, that we should give up large-scale sort of computational uses and that's it. But I'm more interested in the question of what kinds of computational resources should we be using. I don't think that using Netflix is as crucial for the survival of the planet, but I think that academic use of computational resources is central to the survival of the planet. And in similar ways, we can start thinking of what would be the ways in which we specify the question of ecological burden, and the ways in which it's not just the negative carbon footprint we are sort of accounting, but we are looking at it in the sort of a critical big picture as well. That's not a great line to finish with, but I also am aware of time, so I'm going to finish here and let's have a discussion. Hopefully there was enough of sort of a thoughts and strands to think about and perhaps have a dialogue about. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just stop sharing as well. I was
Yeah,
thinking
thank
of,
you.
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just about to thank you, Jussi, for the presentation. And actually, we thought that Marek could have a short commentary and then open discussion.
Yeah, but I will be very brief because I don't want to steal all the time from the others. Just maybe a very short three reflections. I mean, first and foremost, I believe Jussi is one of the very few thinkers who tries to bring together these two perspectives, technological and ecological perspectives, because in today's humanities, we have on the one hand all technological, digital, computational, AI, IT humanities, and then on the other hand, environmental, green, blue, eco, and other humanities, but rarely the two meet. And I think that's the key contribution, and I think this is very important actually to consider and to think and to discuss the two perspectives together. And of course, however, it is a tricky question, how to combine these two perspectives. And you put it very nicely, referring to Plato and Derrida. Indeed, technology is a pharmacon. And maybe just first brief question, and still, what is the poison and what is the cure in technology? And I mean, can we actually happily synthesize or combine these approaches, or should we at the end actually decide that one of them should, let's say, lead the way? And maybe that's one one. And second point, I mean, what was great that you reminded us, let's say, key lessons of science and technology studies and of media theology, namely the materiality of digital technology and digital culture. This is another thing we tend to forget. Digital is something invisible on the cloud, etc. But actually, it's very much about the real energetic and material cost we should discuss. And also, we should really think about the ecological regulation of digital technology. But then, again, it's of course very tricky, because, I mean, all these visions of regulations you hinted toward also might require a very different political regime. I mean, in the system of liberal democracies, it's very hard to imagine how we start regulate all these institutions, these private companies, these activities, and just wondering whether you have any ideas. I mean, how to actually fulfill this requirement of regulation in the democratic society. So should we change the political regime and become authoritarian with a good intention of saving the planet? And just finally, very short.
Go ahead.
I mean, I was of course very happy that you brought along the question of history and Tiber Chakrabarty, because this has been my own field for the last few years. And also try to work with this idea of the collision of human and natural history, and what are the new forms of history. And I've been trying to develop this idea about modern human history and the version of the multi-scholar history and multi-species history, and etc. But again, it remains very, very difficult, considering that, I mean, even if you try to write modern human history or multi-species history, it remains deeply human, because it's after all us who are writing this history, and we can of course have some kind of empathy toward other forms of life, but nevertheless it's still very human. And therefore I also feel that this plea of Chakrabarty to kind of transcend the human history is a kind of utopian project, and I'm kind of struggling to see actually in real historiographical practice what this would mean. So these 3 points pick up if something you like, but then let's take other questions.
Yeah, that's great. Super nice questions, big questions, but I'll try to address all of these if possible. Pharmacon first. I didn't really kind of elaborate it enough as well, but the ways in which it sort of builds on the history of philosophy into more recent technological theorization is really, really interesting. So I want to say that the brief version is that the realization of technology as both carrying a particular material weight and being part of the large-scale restructuring that was supposed to save us, 1990s, it was still the idea that, okay, now with the move from atoms to bits is a move to a really sustainable future, which turned out to be anything but that is the historical version. and the ways in which that sort of relates to the expansion of understanding of media to all kinds of chemical pollution across landscapes that I dealt with in geology of media. But then also this interests me a lot. And this is why I want to make sure that we do not do anything stupid on a broader level as well. Most of the things, a lot of the things that we know about the massive scale of climate change, for instance, if we take a very quote unquote specific topic, is at the back of computational sensing. So sensing, data analytics, and computational methods since the Cold War, as we know from Paul Edwards, is the reason why we actually even know about this in its current form as well. So it's really is that sort of a form of knowledge, and it's the material weight of that knowledge that is of interest to me. And I kind of pitched the notion of media natures as a response to this as well, but I won't go into that. The question about regulation is super interesting. And the short version of this is that it's not a new idea, but I'm adamant about this, that much of the sort of, and I think, I forgot the name of that novelist, but I remember that some years ago, there was a great column by this novelist whose name I just forgot, but basically pointing out to the fact that the notion of carbon footprint was, if not invented, at least sufficiently mobilized by petro-fossil fuel lobby to mostly focus on individual carbon footprint use. Whereas this basically strategically, as we still know from popular discourse, hides the other sorts of institutional levels. And the other sorts of institutional levels is where I'm really interested in regulation to happen, whether it's the data center industry, whether it's the level of universities, which are very good as entities. We as individuals, we might be very active, but universities as entities are extremely conservative and extremely poor in reacting to any of these issues. That would be the level where regulation should happen. And indeed, it should have probably a democratic base, but also at the center of it should be much more radical measures. But as we know from political climate, it's not going to happen easily. There's a great book that, again, as historians, we appreciate, I think. Naomi Oreskes, Harvard historian of technology, and Stephen Conway, right? Conway, the Collapse of Western Civilization, which is a fiction, but it's based on the factual sort of policies and lobbyism of contemporary culture. It basically projects a 100-year scenario where the authoritarian Chinese state was able to react quickly, whereas the democratic governments, completely under the sort of influence of lobbyists, was the one which didn't react. That's like a really stupid short version of the book that is itself short, but not stupid. It's a nice book if you don't know. And Naomi Oreskes is the one that we know from her work on tobacco campaign lobbyists and so forth. And then the Chakrabarti bit, really briefly. Yeah, you're right. And this is also, I remember that this was, and for a good reason, this was a critique that also my early interest in cultural history. I remember in seminars where the point was that, okay, but how do you then write any non-human or more than human things when you're the human writing as well? And I want to say that a lot of the sort of a critical post-humanities and some of the modern human discourse is probably best thought of as not the replacement of the typical, let's say, the sort of, the biological definition of the human, but firstly, understanding that any humans are already involved in multiple ecological chains. In other words, it's not just the human that is ever working there as such. It's like the Copernican or the Freudian term, but now with the sort of animal turn that we're sort of always writing with our environments. And then the more political version of it is that not everybody was human for a long time. And the critical post-humanities that I mostly like is the version that really looks at it is from the point of view of also decolonial and other agendas. In other words, that, okay, it is also the human that was not recognized as human, as in racialized, gendered, and such versions. So we kind of look at it from those perspectives. That is, again, for my colleagues in cultural history, and you as well, Marek, and everybody, is the familiar version since 1980s, new cultural histories and such. The the versions of the marginalized, the versions of what kinds of voices are being, authoring those histories as well. So technically, perhaps human, but at the same time, at the back of all these kind of histories that imply the others that were not necessarily in the picture. That's not a full answer, but at least it's a nod towards your great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Was it Ihab first and then Milan?
Thank you. Thank you, Jussi. This is great warning for all of us, I think, the kind of lecture. But I just want to maybe catch up with this point where you ended up with this whole idea of non-human history and the possibility of basically let's say not just the stereotype, but also the categorization of what is human and what is not human. So I'm pretty critical about this whole Anthropocene development, because I don't actually see a human history without natural history. You see, that has never been the case in any way. But I just want to bring back this whole notion of crisis that you brought also, but didn't reflect on. But maybe the whole idea of crisis is not just a crisis of technology, but maybe it's also a crisis of the inequality of the accessibility to technology. For example, we have Estonia as the most digitized European country, let's say. That's at least how you address it. But we're talking about also a very limited number of people. So the population 1.3, for example, and if you compare it, like, for example, a country like Egypt with 100 million, with a very little different economy, etc. So that kind of inequality is like almost by creating these kind of paradigms, you're actually recreating the same things that we are trying to criticize in terms of the inequality of the resources, but the inequality of the possibilities and the chances even to digitize. Like who can have, and let's not forget that we assume in this kind of literature, all what we read, that everybody has the same accessibility to the internet and to the whole digital culture and to electricity, while actually the whole earth, when you talk about the global south, which is also a critical term for me, I don't like that kind of category, but looking at Africa or Asia or etc., there is still like primitive spaces which never had or still do not have any access to some of these basic resources that that can qualify them even to make the next step on the ladder of digitization. So I'm thinking about maybe instead of crisis, because that's a kind of abused term, if you can maybe speak a tiny bit about that notion of crisis in relation to inequality, and actually not just the economic, but also the whole possibility of the as if. The possibility of the as if, the possibility of being in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I share also that Global South is a good shorthand, but actually the fact that, as we know, it cannot work in such sort of a simple geographic terms is where it gets much more complicated. And that's the point about that. So Global South in relation to the ICT development is exactly the problem of how to solve that as well. And that's why a lot of the ways in which this needs to maneuver cannot reproduce the sort of environmentalism that externalizes, again, the responsibility to developing countries. And so far, as been noted in some of the quotes there, but also in research, at least the better ones, is that the problematic situation is that computing happens here, but climate change sort of repercussions take place mostly in other vulnerable regions. Although also, as we know, Europe is actually temperatures are rising much more rapidly here than in many other places. But that's aside the question. I think that's why the question cannot be the only exactly that the haves and have-nots, but the ways in which we somehow start building those agendas that think computational sustainability in a radical way that doesn't sort of take away the possibility of development, but at the same time reduces its environmental cost. That's easier said than done, but at the same time, that really relates to the sort of things that we should be pioneering in the first place as well. In other words, we should probably reduce first in quote unquote global north as part of the planetary sort of a realization of the development doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens across the sort of a long historical periods. And hence we have a particular responsibility. Although when we say we, already within Europe, we know that there's sort of a like the idea of a unified Europe with similar resources is another problematic. And that's sort of a like questions of looking at the environmentalism of the poor and the ways in which resources are already scarce in different populations sociologically as well, and in different countries in Europe is another thing as well. So I totally am with you that this is an equation that I feel completely I don't know how to solve it. I don't know if anyone knows how to solve it, but I also think that exactly the point about low tech or sort of a like going off the grid or going off computation is not going to happen. It's not realistic because you know, computational things will grow and energy needs based on that.
Yeah, maybe just to add a small comment, because actually the whole point is about learning best practices, and my idea is that you end up in the same cycle of this whole Euro. Coming up with best practices ends up in the same cycle of actually the Eurocentric, let's say, technology thinking that we like. Best practices in this case about reuse or about sustainability, etc., would also be limited within a particular paradigm that takes into consideration the work that is being done in a particular environment and a particular geography and a particular historical development. So that's actually my worry. Like, we can come up with a best practice for Europe, but how do you actually pass that into other geographies or other?
Right. Yeah, exactly. But that's probably is that there won't be any sort of a one size fits all solution. But even thinking through of what's happening now in terms of the template of mostly Western corporations providing the infrastructure to quote unquote developing nations is already the problematic bit. While, you know, then thinking through what can be provided or helped with that is not just imposing a Western imperialism in those terms. Absolutely true. Absolutely what you say, but that's why it's puzzling when we know that even one country solution is puzzling and difficult, let alone region like Europe, let alone bloody planet.
Was actually Mila have this?
Yes, yeah. I will maybe open. Thank you so much. Super thought-provoking talk. I felt bad already before your talk about my own research practices, and now I feel even worse.
Oh no!
I'm one of the bad guys using super wasteful, huge, large-scale data sets and super wasteful methods. And also, although I would like, of course, to describe my practices as kind of like logical chains of just doing what is needed, but of course, as we all know, the real practice of kind of like, or the real everyday life of a research is kind of like, it's quite chaotic process. You do something, then you abandon it, and then you do something else, and then you try to think how they. But I had two trains of thoughts with your talk, and so the first one actually relates to what Ihab was saying about this sharing and inequalities. But I just started to think that as we are now starting to also digitize these Lotman materials and building the digital archive, so perhaps one of the ways to tackle also these kind of like things would be to establish both structures and practices for sharing enriched data. So if I would use some part of Lotman's archive, then train some data, and then there would be a kind of like easy way for me to share, to kind of like bring back the enriched data, especially if I have access to supercomputing, but not all scholars have it. So kind of like to kind of like expand maybe this kind of like the idea of open data and sharing in kind of like more, you know, systematic ways. So that's kind of like one idea. The other one that I actually started to think is kind of like also the sustainability of digital data in other terms, in kind of like the in terms that digital formats become obsolete much faster than kind of like the old printing, for instance, or materialities. So of course this also brings additional troubles when we need to transform from old formats to new ones in order to be able to access the data in digital format. So that's also one thing that needs to be taken into consideration, so that we wouldn't limit in a way the kind of like inquiry and knowledge, but to try to kind of like moderate in a ways that we do what's necessary, but not maybe too much. So I will also try to moderate myself, although it's not always possible, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, you're a great example, Mila, in the sense that you're like somebody who employs the work, but also that's my point exactly, is that we shouldn't personalize it as sort of like us starting to feel bad, but more to think exactly of the ways in which we might be able to come up with protocols and ways of practice that basically build much more long-term solutions. In other words, open data, in terms of focusing exactly those questions of formats and the ways in which we can move beyond proprietary formats and the wastefulness that relates to the political economy of proprietary formats, where there is file formats and such, and trying to think through the institutional practices and contributions in those terms as well. That's exactly that sort of like reason why I'm not so keen always on slow computing or low tech, even if they're much more nuanced than what I'm now sort of hinting they are. They're much more nuanced, but because we actually, I think academia should have the resources for large-scale computational things, but we might be also, and this might relate to the question earlier as well, but perhaps there are things that we can do in terms of sharing resources and sharing of particular things that then become much more systematic input back to the community and back to the commons, so to speak, of the idea of commons also in terms of this, that we are sort of not solving the problem for others in other places, but if we are able to cut back radically, it's already something. And I'm not saying that we in academia cut back, but in societal levels as well. And again, my example, this doesn't apply to us, is the fact that, you know, cutting down and enforcing regulation on private jets would actually already reduce massively airline industry emissions. So in other words, there's the particular way in which we need to think through political economy of really sort of a like wasteful uses vis-a-vis the uses like your practice, Mila, and hopefully all of ours. So I'm not sure about mine, but hopefully all of ours that are actually bringing much more to the community than taking from it, right? So that's the reason why I'm sort of still proposing that we need to stick with computational methods while we're trying to think of best practices and proposing them on institutional levels as well.
Well, thank you. Actually, we are a little bit already running over time, but if I commented a little bit from the point of view of what we are doing, I've noticed actually that the CPU time that is consumed, for example, in Finland, it's rising like every year, and in our case, it's actually for free. For all universities, so we can spend as much computer hours as we like. So it's a very tricky situation, and I've noticed from previous projects that we can easily create like interfaces that actually consume CPU time, even though we don't do anything. They and of course in the projects that we have, of course, particular processes that need computational efforts and energy, but also the maintenance. And I think it's also decisive for Lotman project, how much the simple use of the database or interface actually consumes energy. It's not only the construction phase, but how it's maintained for the future. And that's really tricky.
Yeah, that is exactly. And yeah, you're right.
Yeah, but I didn't have any question, but
no, but that's great. I'm grateful that sort of bringing that in as well, because it's a lot of the things I said needs to be made much more concrete, and also then kind of maneuvering the possibilities of going totally absurd, but actually looking at pragmatic ways in which we can do something on institutional levels. And I want to say that the punchline here is that it's not just practice in the sense that, okay, we sort of are doing this to, change our everyday practice, but it is really about methodology and trying to think through of the materials of methodology in those terms.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
Right.
Yeah, well, let's take Daniela's brief question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will try to be brief, and going back to the issue of environmental crisis and inequality. But I understand we are all we all agree on this, but it's not possible to take it to separate them. But when the issue is how to we do scholarship, but this is politics already. So what does it mean? How do we articulate scholarship with activism? And particularly, is it possible to change our way of thinking and our way of acting? Well, I pretty much like the idea advanced by, it was already kind of a long time ago, by Slavoj Žižek, when he was trying to rethink what is false consciousness. For Marx, false consciousness was they don't know what they do. But when Žižek suggested to replace it with a modern version of it, that would be, they know very well what they do, but they still are doing it. So that's exactly what we know. We have all this scholarship, all this information we know, but still we continue to do it, and ourselves. Not to speak of the fact that we cannot in any way address these global inequalities because we don't have this global governance kind of capability. So how do you relate your work with this more political side and or scholarship and activism? Or how do you think it for yourself?
Yeah, exactly. You're right that that's the tricky territory where we know how badly things can go wrong if certain kind of politics starts to interfere with academia as well. But I'm sort of approaching it from that really interesting position, and if we had lots of time, we could really dig into it as well. The idea that on the one hand, methods at the end of the day are about activities. They're very regulated, normative activities based on traditions of disciplines. That's what methods are. But they have material weights, and they are premised on all kinds of things that are automated, because that's what PhD training is. It is automation into certain things, field work, the ways in which we sort of act. And that shares a ground with the fact that we are all part of an academic community. The idea that we're workers. We're workers in institutions, and we're part of a community that is localizable, particularly university we're in, but also the international community of academia, which I still find one of the most beautiful things about academia is that we somehow feel that we're part of this community. And those two things, there's a sort of Venn triangle section there as well about activity and about the community. And I want to see somehow that in the ideal sense, and I'm not saying I'm a great example, but the ideal sense, it is also giving back to the community in the sense like we've done at the back of, let's say, again, this is perhaps a bad example, but perhaps not, the ways in which suddenly at the, the most recent part of Russian invasion of Ukraine, many universities opened doors to Ukrainians, some a bit more progressively with really sustainable sort of funding formats. And we found the money in various places because of the crisis. Again, crisis is a term, like was pointed out, is a tricky one, but used to crisis here. And we are able to make these suddenly quite contingent decisions based on something as well. And that sort of echoes to me the idea that we need to be thinking about also the other ways in which we can think of this contingent situation that we find ourselves in. My last slide had the phrase business as usual, but even if we would accept the idea that academia is a business, we probably don't. But as we know, some people are making money at the back of us, like Elsevier does. But business as usual, where as usual has radically changed, there is no more as usual. We might not have any of these institutions in 50 years. And that sort of like is quite a horizon for thinking. I don't believe in the sort of like that we should feel existentially bad or that we should feel super gloomy. We probably, but the horizon could be thought through the notion of the collapse. But again, that's almost too dark. But it's still these sort of horizons that the community that we're doing the activity of methods is also a future community. And that's sort of a like future perspective. And this sounds very much like I'm suddenly talking like Greta Thunberg, but in the sense of that there's a particular like a temporal dimension to this as well that I'm interested in, as well as, again, one more thing, Dipesh Chakrabarty and the Modern Human. Even with the doubt that we might have in terms of some of the agenda, I kind of think that it's also that we are sort of thinking for others, and the ways in which we're thinking for others, including, this sounds very hippie-esque, but like nature, animals, biodiversity is somehow part of the ethics of this sort of a work as well. But this goes off on a tangent. But mostly I'm thinking that the combining axis is really the community aspect and the practice, and thinking through that as part of ethics that is about being with others.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Jussi. Perhaps we should at this point end, and you have actually a free Saturday, so
yeah, exactly. I'm going to go do family lunches. Very nice to see you all, and really a wonderful points dialogue. I wish I was there.
Okay, thank you, Jussi. See you.
Bye bye. Moikka.